Okay, let's dive into what was being said about where COVID came from. You have to remember where we've come from to understand the full scope here of the dishonesty, of the wrongness around this issue. And here we have conspiracy headlines. This was from last year. NPR, scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic's emergence. CNN, Anthony Fauci just crushed Donald Trump's theory on the origins of the coronavirus. Guardian, ignore the conspiracy theory. Scientists know COVID-19 wasn't created in a lab. They know it was not created in a lab. That's what they say. And, Washington Post here said, Cotton acknowledged, this is because Senator Tom Cotton was another proponent early on of the lab leak theory. Here's what they were saying. Cotton acknowledged there's no evidence that the disease originated at the lab. Instead, he suggested it's necessary to ask Chinese authorities about the possibility, fanning the embers of a conspiracy theory that has been repeatedly debunked by experts. Debunked! A conspiracy theory! Proven untrue! Only crazies believe it. And if you needed a little more of this consensus, well, none other than Dr. Fake Consensus himself, Fauci, was saying this back in May of 2020.
If you look at the evolution of the virus in bats and what's out there now, it's very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated. If it was in the wild and evolving, the likelihood it jumped species naturally. Someone will say, well, maybe somebody took it from the wild, put it in the lab, and then it escaped from the lab. But that means it was in the wild to begin with. So that's why I don't get what they're talking about. If it isn't manipulated in the lab, and you're trying to say it escaped from the lab, then how did it get in the lab?
Right. That's where gain of function research would come in. That's where manipulating the virus, let's just get to what Fauci is saying now. How about this? Instead of me debating Dr. Fauci, because he's the great expert, right? And what do I know? I'm just some guy with a radio and a TV show. Let's have Fauci debate Fauci, because here's what he said earlier this month.
There's a lot of cloudiness around the origins of COVID-19 still. So I wanted to ask, are you still confident that it developed naturally?
I'm not convinced about that. I think that we should continue to investigate what went on in China until we find out, to the best of our ability, exactly what happened.
I'm not convinced. Wait a second. I thought everything had been debunked. I thought only conspiracy theorists talk about the lab leak. I mean, I showed you all those big, important, serious media outlets that said case closed, came from the wild. Just zoonotic transmission from animals to people. Just kind of happened. Just sort of happened. The fact that there were some cases of this found right near the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which happened to be studying bat coronaviruses and therefore concentrating samples of those viruses and what we now believe to be far substandard safety precautions, that is supposed to be a coincidence you ignore. They talk about the wet market like this is some secret special wet market. No, there are wet markets. In fact, they're all over China. So it just so happened to be at this one, right near this one facility, huh? Well, that's why Fauci now is saying he's not convinced that it's naturally occurring. You could also note that earlier on when he was talking about it, he didn't really have a whole lot of imagination or even expertise, it seems, when discussing it. A virus that is naturally occurring in nature does not necessarily have any interaction with human beings, and a virus that is then concentrated in a laboratory setting where there will be people and that is manipulated in a laboratory setting creates a much greater risk, doesn't it? Yes, indeed it does. And if the virus was naturally occurring and it was a mutation just from some cave somewhere where there were bats dwelling in China, why haven't we been able to prove that link then? Why haven't we been able to show who got infected near or at that cave? Because we have been able to show they were infected near the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In fact, it's even more clear than that from the recent evidence. Here's just to note, former FDA Chief Scott Gottlieb, who His role is to go on TV as an expert who tells you whichever way the consensus is shifting. So he's certain, so long as that's what all the so-called smart people are saying that they're certain of. And then the moment that changes, then he's certain of something else. But all of a sudden, he's much more open to the circumstantial case, as he calls it, that COVID may have originated in a lab. Play 5.
I think the challenge right now is that the side of the ledger that supports the thesis that this came from a zoonotic source, from an animal source, hasn't budged. And the side of the ledger that suggests that this could have come out of a lab has been continuing to grow. So people a year ago who said, well, this probably came from nature, it's really unlikely it came from a lab, maybe a year ago that kind of a statement made a lot of sense because that was the more likely scenario. But we haven't found the intermediate host. We found no evidence of this virus in an animal anywhere. So I think the ledger on the side of the lab continues to grow. And the question for a lot of people is going to be, when are too many coincidences too much?
Yes. When is the circumstantial case the only believable case? Because otherwise you'd have to be a coincidence theorist. Seems like we're getting closer to that now. We're not quite there. See, we shouldn't take the perspective, we shouldn't take the approach that so many did on this issue for so long, which is to say that you claim you have consensus and certainty when you don't. Or you could have consensus, but you certainly don't have certainty. That's been a problem all along. What is the part of the circumstantial case of the lab leak theory of COVID-19 that you need to hear about because it seems to be pretty important? Wall Street Journal over the weekend, 3 researchers from China's Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick enough in November 2019 they sought hospital care, according to a previously undisclosed U.S. intelligence report. The details of the reporting go beyond a State Department fact sheet issued during the final days of the Trump administration, which said that several researchers at the lab, a center for the study of coronaviruses and other pathogens, became sick in autumn 2019 with symptoms consistent with COVID-19 and common seasonal illness. Now, they can try to explain this away by saying, oh, well, it could have been the flu. It could have been a really bad cold, and that's why they went to the hospital. These are virus researchers. I think they'd know if they were sick enough that they really needed to go to the hospital. And so why was this happening right before the major outbreak and then the global spread of the virus? That's what you would at least call an indicator. It's certainly a clue. It seems to be, if not evidence, a signpost of sorts, something worth further investigation. But what is the plan to look into this? To continue to leave the World Health Organization at the forefront. Of course, that's what the Biden administration wants to do. But we don't have the answers here. That's one very important takeaway. We do not know. But another important point to make here is that people said they knew and were sure when they did not and should not have been. And they were the same people telling you about lockdowns being a great idea and double masking and single masking and washing your groceries with Lysol. They fake certainty to get you to obey. And then later on you say, hold on a second, couldn't we have had an open and honest discussion about this?